everyone. Welcome to the 272nd episode of the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and your co-host,
Kevin Toffel.
And we have a pretty brisk show for you today. We're going to be talking about IBM and facial recognition. Plus, MIT has a brain on a chip. News from Lutron. A way to control your home from a Commodore 64. A little bit of intelligence coming from Finn, detecting water usage among the U.S. during COVID. We've got Roomy adding some sensors, which will be exciting for those of us who love presents. We've got fundraising from a popular cooking gadget/service. Google's adding some new stuff for Assistant. We've got some industrial IoT news on the Bluetooth front and on a factory as a service product. Plus, Kevin's going to talk about the 3 technologies to keep an eye out for the next smart home era. And our guest this week is Andrew Farah of Density, and he is doing people counting. And it's also a visit of an old friend. I talked to Andrew 5 years ago when he started his company, and so it's kind of nice to see where the company ended up. And we're going to hear from one of our sponsors, Calix, whose Wi-Fi systems can help ISPs deliver much better service in the home. And now we're going to start the show and hear from our first sponsor, Very. Are you looking for an IoT development team who's been there, done that? Very's award-winning full-service IoT development firm will work with you to deliver your IoT solution on time and on budget. You can learn more at verypossible.com. That's www.verypossible.com. Okay, Kevin, let's kick it off. We are still in week 2 of protests for Black Lives Matter and also against police brutality. I would say that they're closely intertwined, but after seeing some of the behavior in this last week, we're like, whoa, is kind of what I've been saying.
Yeah. And as we talked about last week, some of the organizations that are policing and trying to keep the peace, are using technology to assist with arrests and identifications. And we noted last week that I think it was like 47 companies are now providing facial recognition software.
I think it was 45, but we also noted that some of the popular ones were not on there.
Right.
And as part of that, I kind of reassessed. I don't want to say reassess because, Kevin, I think we do a decent job of pointing out how IoT technology can quickly, in the wrong hands, become a surveillance tool. So I don't feel like we've ignored the possibility there.
No, we don't sugarcoat that by any means.
But I do think that we are probably not being forward-looking enough, saying they are looking at ways that technology can actually change the world in the ways that we want it to see it happen. And so hopefully we will do more of that, even as we're still covering the stuff like smart home gadgets and factories as a service. So that's going to be our challenge going forward. And it's not really a challenge. It's just a way for us to be better humans and to be better journalists in this. And related to all of this, IBM CEO this week put out he's a relatively fresh CEO. He just came on board, in the last month or 2. But he's saying that IBM is pulling out of the facial recognition space. And he wrote a letter to Congress that actually went into detail on why this is happening and what Congress should do and how IBM will support them in creating laws that make police departments a little bit more accountable. So the letter is actually really good. We're going to include a link to it. It talks about how IBM's president back in 1953 basically said, hey, IBM is going to give everyone a job. There is no enforcement of Jim Crow laws at IBM facilities. I will say IBM has had several Black employees that have done well there. Like every other organization in America, I don't think they're probably
diverse enough at this point.
Yeah, I was going to say IBM may have supported Germany back during World War II, but they're not institutionalizing racism. So good for them. And what they're doing here is they are going to no longer offer general purpose IBM facial recognition software or analysis software. They're not going to condone, in fact, they will actually oppose the use of facial recognition technology offered by other vendors for mass surveillance, racial profiling, violation of basic human rights and freedoms, or any purpose that is not consistent with their values and principles of trust and transparency. They also would like to start the conversation about how facial recognition technology should be used by law enforcement agencies. This is a conversation that Microsoft is also pushing for, so we should see this very soon. And this is good. I will say that IBM is not saying they're going to stop working with police agencies. They do a lot of work with police agencies. They provide algorithm and software for like gunshot detection and all kinds of other things. But this is a step forward, and we have talked a lot about racial bias in facial recognition software.
We've seen so many examples of that, so that's certainly not a problem that's been solved.
Yes, and IBM saying they want to see that audited and reported in law enforcement. And when it comes to surveillance, it's a little fuzzy here because I don't know if IBM's like, if they're not racially biased, then heck yeah, let's do some surveillance. But I don't think that's what's happening here. There's also a really large portion here about training. And this is something Kevin and I probably should talk about in future episodes because I hear this from business leaders across the board, not just at IBM, but even people like in manufacturing. As we add more technology to places, training is going to be a huge issue because right now, 4 years of college or maybe 2 years of a vocational program early on in your life is not enough anymore. Mm-mm. We're going to have to rethink the way we do education so it's kind of continual throughout our lives. And that's going to be a big shift. And we have to think about how to fund that. Who's going to pay for? Is that something employees do? Is that something employers pay for? I don't know.
A lot of the larger tech companies have started educational programs for, STEM in the classroom, and that's great. And it's nice to see the private sector doing that. But I can speak from experience because I'm currently enrolled in a 2-year college. I have my bachelor's already, so this is more of a guest student type thing. But I work with a lot of younger students in the comp sci department, for example, and other related departments. And the training that they need for today's jobs and tomorrow's isn't there right now. And actually, I'll disclose I'm on the committee for curriculum for the CS department for 3 years to try and help change that. And I can't do it myself. And even if I could, it's only at one local community college. So I totally agree with what IBM has said here. And they've done quite a bit in this area.
Yes. And other companies like AT&T has retrained a lot of their workers using like Udacity and that sort of thing.
Yes.
So we'll talk more about that. Here we are getting into it. But there is other news.
But I can't believe you left the biggest part out.
What was the biggest part?
What was the name of the president in 1953 of IBM?
Oh, T.J. Watson, Watson. I have covered Watson since it existed. And I'm sure someone told me this at some point, but I totally I read that and I was like, oh.
Now it makes sense.
It makes sense. Possibly for the second time.
Maybe that wasn't the most important thing, but I still think it's worth mentioning.
It's good for your trivia night.
Yes.
There you go. Add that to the list. Okay, Kevin, MIT. What are they doing?
What are they not doing at MIT? They're always doing something.
I know.
Last week, they have basically announced they've designed a brain on a chip. And I am really into this from an AI perspective and an artificial brain perspective because I just think it's cool, number one. And I do think it's the future. So essentially what they've done is instead of using transistors, which is typically used on chips, they've used memristors. And the difference is instead of having a transistor with a value of 0 or 1, memristors can have a gradient value in there. So you're not limited to just the 2 inputs or outputs.
It's not binary, y'all.
There you go. That's a better way of saying it. It's not binary. So as a test, what they've done is they created a grayscale image of the Captain America shield, because I guess they're Marvel fans, and then equated each pixel to a corresponding memristor to see if their brain on a chip could remember the image. And sure enough, it does. And it can actually reproduce it many times. It's kind of a early implementation of maybe storage of memories is kind of how they're positioning this. It's early days. I just thought this was a really cool story and probably a good article to read if you're into this kind of thing.
Yes. And as a chip reporter, I will tell you that I have been covering memristors since the early aughts. And this concept is called neuromorphic computing. It is putting brains on chips. I remember all the way back in like 2008, IBM had recreated a rat brain, not on a single chip, but it was a big project. And then Intel has a lot of work here. The idea is that as we run into the end of Moore's law, we have to figure out ways to be more energy efficient. So consume less power while we're doing all the computing that we need to do, and to keep it on smaller chunks of real estate. And that's one of these things. So a memristor, basically, you give it that image, it remembers it, and then anytime you light those up, it's going to remember the same image. And so it's a more efficient way to store and trigger a memory on a computer. So very exciting and still very science fiction and far away, but
yes,
we'll keep an eye on it. All right. In today news, in news that you can use today, Lutron, the Serena line that handles their roller shades and blinds, they now have wooden battery-powered smart blinds. These are what we probably call plantation shutters usually, and they're everywhere. Basically, you can buy these starting at $599 each for a standard 3-foot by 5-foot blind. And then you put these in and they open the blinds and shut the blinds with Google, Madam A, HomeKit. And they also have enabled a little bit more intelligence. They have an algorithm they call the no fade option. And what that does is it tracks the sun throughout the day and it tilts the blinds up or down to help kind of reduce the impact of the sunlight on your floors and furniture and, just broadly in your life. These blinds will tilt, so you can open them by tilting them, but you're still going to have to use the string to raise them because the motor on them is just not strong enough to raise a full wood blind. So I am so excited. Y'all know I love Lutron, but I'm actually buying the Serena shades for my new house, and I have some lovely large windows. So I will be able to tell you how all of these feel and work, although not the wooden blinds, which are the ones that are out. But still exciting if you have these, or you want wooden blinds if you like that look. All right, what else we got?
So also exciting, at least to me and anybody else who might have an old Commodore 64 lying around, you can purchase a $99 multifunction interface board called the Zeus LT. You attach this to your Commodore 64. You use the C64 basic language for programming. And what the interface board does, it allows you to connect, develop, and test to IoT things, little projects like lights and buzzers and all kinds of things. It's kind of like turning your C64 into an Arduino board.
Yay.
I thought I like it.
It is exciting. Okay. This is just a little news release that came out last week from Finn, which is a company that does a smart water leak detection unit in your home. They basically said, hey, everybody's home from COVID-19, right? We're all home for the pandemic. What are people doing with their water? And basically people are using 21% more water per day because they're working and sheltering from home. The average U.S. home used 729 additional gallons of water in April than it did in February. And that broke down into about 21% more sink usage. That must be all that hand washing. 20% more toilet use. I think we should be washing our hands more then, y'all. 16% more shower use. I'm showering less during the pandemic.
So am I. I was just going to say that. Mm-hmm.
And 3% more washing machine use, which totally makes sense because, you got to wash your clothes no matter what. But this is fun data, but really what it's useful for is saying, oh, hey, if you send everyone home, here's what happens, which gives water utilities more data. It could help you with your bill, I guess, if you're thinking about that. And it's just a sense of, hey, now we can get more data. What can we do from it? What can we infer from it? So just thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah. So something else that is kind of fun is having lights go on in a room when you walk in and having them go off when you walk out, but not having a motion detector. And that's what RoomMe does from IntelliThings. And I reviewed that back in November. It was a little hit or miss for me at the time, so maybe it's worth a second look. But the news is that RoomMe has added IFT and Habitat support to its Bluetooth sensors that you put around the house. So that's good. More integrations is always good.
We love integrations. And I think it might be time. The first time we tried RoomMe, it wasn't awesome, but maybe it's been 8 months. Maybe we should try it again.
Absolutely.
All right. This is a blast from the past for me. Drop, which is a recipe and smart cooking company. They raised $13.3 million. So this is a new round of funding for this company. I love Drop. I met them probably back in 2013. Ben Harris was the CEO, and he started out with a connected scale, but he blew me away with his idea of creating a taxonomy and a way to connect kitchens and to connect food with the devices that cook them. And that's really where Drop has been focused. The scale is kind of, I think it still is out there, but the real money and the real value is in Drop's Kitchen OS. And that connects everything from your recipes, and your grocery stores can get together, and then all the way to the appliances that cook them. And they work with a bunch of different brands like Bosch, Electrolux, GE appliances, the Instant brands, LG, Thermomix, and Panasonic. All of their gear works with, ta-da, the Drop OS. And I love it. So I'm still high on this company. I still love it. And the new investors are Alpha Edison and Morpheus Ventures.
Even though I still have the scale and don't use it, these days part of their platform is actually having like recipes as well for all these different appliances, yes?
Yes.
Clever.
Yeah, it's very clever. That was the original goal. They thought they needed to have hardware to like get that, but I don't think they do anymore. So yay. All right. Ooh, Google Assistant gets more skills.
Well, it does and it doesn't. This one has me scratching my head a little bit, but in the Google Assistant developer documentation, there are some new device types. And one of them makes sense. It is new. It's a styler, which the docs say a styler is a unique device that refreshes clothes through steaming and sanitation.
Oh, it's like one of those steam cabinets that Samsung and LG show at CES every year.
Right. So that makes sense. But the other one, this is the new device now. Are you ready? The device type is called doorbell. The description is exactly what you'd think. Doorbells can let people know someone's at the door. It's a read-only device. It sends notifications or streams. But you Google have Nest Hello and other supported doorbells with Google Home. So I don't know if maybe this isn't so much for new devices specifically, but maybe with the new works with Google platform, perhaps?
I believe that you couldn't pull up video on Google Home devices from your other doorbells. Was
the
that
display,
true?
You mean? Yeah.
On the display. So
possible.
That's my hunch, because I think we're going to see Arlo and some others announcing their Google integrations for their doorbells.
Right. And that makes sense when I look at the recommended traits for these in the development docs: clip, camera stream, and object detection. Makes sense.
It does. Now, the question is, will they be as fast getting to your Google display as the Nest Hello?
If the Nest Hello is using the same APIs and such, it should be an identical experience. However, I do not know.
Yeah, because I'm in the market for lots of things, y'all. Y'all are going to hear over the next couple of weeks as I move in, like, I just bought this to put in my house. But I am looking at doorbells. And the reason I was like, oh, I love the Google Nest integration. I hate the fact that it is utterly useless without a monthly subscription. Like, it's only 3 hours on the Nest doorbell that I can see, that I get like a little. 3. Yeah, they're like images. They're not even full clips.
They're like animated GIFs, yeah, at best.
Yeah, I'm like, that doorbell is literally, to me, it is functionless without the subscription. And it's also a very expensive doorbell. So I'm not excited about that. I don't think I'm going to buy that. So I would love to see a better integration with other things.
Right. Makes sense.
So we'll see. Maybe I'll hold off on the doorbell for a little bit longer. I've had a whole year without a doorbell, y'all. But I have a dog. It's good. Okay. In industrial IoT news, I've got 2 kind of fun stories. The first is On Asset Intelligence. It is a supply chain tracking company. They have built a Bluetooth low energy hub and tested it, and it read 12,000 Bluetooth 5 tags in a single room in under 60 seconds. Boom. And you guys may be thinking, well, yeah, that's what Bluetooth tags are for. But that level of scale, 12,000 in under a minute, is pretty phenomenal. Like, I have not heard that, because a lot of these hubs, and we're talking about companies like Cassia, we've got Rigato. Basically, they were trying to do Bluetooth tracking in a scalable way because Bluetooth is kind of limited in the number of devices. And there's no hard and fast rule, but it's limited by computing power, by the density of RF. But it was like 100 devices. I mean, it was not a lot. And we got to like 1,000. And that's nothing if you imagine putting a tag on like all the equipment in a hospital, for example. So that's why this matters. And this helps bring Bluetooth to the enterprise. Yay. Okay. Also probably pretty good for these track and trace because we're adding even more Bluetooth to these systems now. The other news on the industrial side is PTC, which just had its LiveWorks event. They have announced an extension of their alliance with Rockwell Automation and Microsoft to create the Factory Insights as a Service platform. This is a cloud platform, so it's based in the cloud. This lets you basically integrate a lot of your gear from Rockwell and from the various PTC companies. PTC owns Kepware that does machine-to-machine integration between different machines. Okay, that was it. Machine-to-machine integration between different machines. It basically, every machine on a factory floor that comes from a different vendor, they kind of speak different languages. Kepware helps integrate those things together and provides you with one view. So think of it as a translator for all the machines out there. ThingWorx, which is a IoT platform that lets you bring devices on, manage them, lifecycle management type stuff. And their Vuforia, that is their AR platform. Some companies use it, some companies don't. But the idea is they're all working together. You can get all of this now. You don't have to build it. They've basically created a platform. If you subscribe to this platform, you just say, hey, these are the things I want to monitor. It starts pulling it in. It starts making it easy for you. And you pay by the month. Very exciting. So that's out there. And hopefully that makes it a little bit easier to put more of your machines and your entire factory online and start making it more efficient. Yay. All right. Now it is time to talk about Kevin's thought of the week.
Deep thoughts.
It was like, it's not really a full thought, but it's close.
It's half a thought. And actually, I'll start it off with a confession. So strap yourselves in. I'm a little bored by the current smart home market. There, I said it. It's true.
It's true. I mean, the biggest news in the smart home market right now is basically like tiny integrations or, hey, this platform you spent money on is now a brick. Yay.
Yeah, even the positive changes are really incremental at this point, and it all stems back from the beginning of what I'll call the mainstream smart home market back in 2015 when Amazon added voice controls for smart home devices to Madam A. And we've had Google and Apple catch up and do the same thing and so on and so forth. And we've got integrations and more products, more brands, and that's all good. But again, it's all very incremental. So to me, it's like we're 5 years in and we need something big or some things big to kick off the next smart home age. So I'll share 3 of them and see if you listeners or you, Stacey, agree or disagree. And we talked about RoomMe a little earlier, and that leads me to the first one. Presence detection. It's still not really all here. There's not many companies that offer it. The ones that do, I haven't had a positive experience with yet. We mentioned RoomMe, and we'll take a second look at it for sure. Earlier this week, Stacey, I think you had either spoken to or reported on Inlo.
Yes.
They do something very similar. They have Bluetooth satellites that are like $40 each. You put around the home and it triangulates where you are based on the Bluetooth signal of your individual phone. So it knows.
Or other devices. That's what was so cool about it.
Yes. And that is good because not everybody, I know somebody on this podcast, in fact, carries their phone with them around the house. I do. I'm not naming names. I wasn't trying to call you out, but.
I'm not ashamed. I leave my phone at places. That's right. I am not glued to my phone.
Listen, I'll be honest. I wear the Apple Watch all the time. So I do occasionally put my phone down or leave the house without it. So there's Bluetooth on that. That would work for me as well. A little Bluetooth tag that I clip on or Bluetooth jewelry that I wear, whatever. Regardless, it's not to me the problem of having Bluetooth in a device. It's having these satellites accurately triangulate who is in what room of my house. And why is that a big deal? Because maybe I want to walk in a room and have a scene of certain lights and music on. And then my wife goes in that same room later. She doesn't want my scene. She wants lower dimmed lights and no music on. And it just happens. That's what's missing right now. Also, second thing, Device discovery and integrations. We've made a lot of progress here in the last 5 years, probably more so in the last 2 or 3, but it's still kind of a siloed approach between Apple, Amazon, Google. Everybody's got their own way of doing things, as we just talked about with the new APIs for Google Home. It just makes it very difficult to integrate devices and have devices be discovered quickly and easily for you. And CHIP, the Connected Home over Internet Protocol initiative, has promise. The big 3 names I just mentioned are part of it. It's organized by the Zigbee Alliance. There are a lot of brands in there. We haven't seen any products that use CHIP for its standards, which that's what it's hoping to do, bring a single standard.
I was like, it's not out yet. That's why no one's using it.
Well,
yes.
There you go. I think 2021, next year, are we expecting products? You've talked to the CHIP folks recently, I think.
We're expecting the certification at the end of this year still, which means we could have products next year.
Okay. And that's fine. That's fine. But I do think that would be huge. There's just too much of the siloed approach and works with this and works with that, or better yet, doesn't work with this or that consumers have to deal with right now.
I agree.
And then lastly, back when Siri came out in 2011, I wrote a piece about the invisible interface, and that was voice commands, because you don't need to learn the interface. You already know how to speak. You already know when you want something done, you can say the command and something hopefully will understand it. Siri did at the time. Now we've got voice assistants on everything. So that's great. But as we said before, voice is not always the best way to control a smart home. It is definitely better to me than pulling out your phone or going to get your phone if you don't carry it and opening up an app. But if there's people around you, or they're sleeping or they're reading or whatever, you don't need to communicate to them. You need to communicate just to the home. And I think that's where gestures can come in. I think this is the hardest problem to solve effectively. Again, you're going to have standards issues, because waving left to right in one smart home may turn your TV off, and waving left to right in another smart home may do something different. And that's not what I want to see. But I also don't want to see cameras. I want to see sensors. So we have a ways to go here, but I think the 3 of these could really kick off a new smart home era.
I am hopeful. And, we haven't talked about this, but I think screens in more places that can you can project onto will also help. But I love this. I agree with you. And we'll see if any of this comes to fruition. If you're listening, please make it happen. Okay. And now it is time for the section of the show where we listen to y'all. It is the IoT Podcast Hotline, which is sponsored by Schlage. The best home automation adds convenience, not hassle. And with its built-in Wi-Fi, the Schlage Encode Smart Wi-Fi Deadbolt shows just how easy secure can be. Learn more at Schlage.com. And because this is sponsored by Schlage, we are giving away a Schlage lock this month to anyone who calls into the hotline and asks us a question. Please, you can call us at 512-623-7424 and be entered to win. All you have to do is call us before the end of the month. That's midnight Eastern on June 30th. And this week's question comes to us from Utah. Brent in Utah specifically. So let's hear from him.
Hello, this is Brent from Utah. I am interested in smoke alarms, smart ones, certainly. I'd love to see what additional functions there are in smoke alarms that maybe will give me a better bang for my buck. Maybe some other sensors or some Wi-Fi extenders, stuff like that. Thanks.
Okay, Brent, we are attacking this question from 2 angles. The first is telling you about some smart smoke alarms out there that offer a few extra features, some of which come at a pretty high price. And we also wanted to make you aware of devices you may already own that now listen for your existing smoke alarms and will send you a notification, because I've always found it weird in this era of smart homes that if a smoke alarm goes off in my house and no one's home, if there is a fire, it is just going to burn down. I won't know until I drive up and I'm like, oh, that's my house. It's a smoldering pile of rubble. So I guess I'll go first with the idea of listening devices, we'll call them. And these are devices that you may already have. The Wyze camera, for example, can be set to listen for your smoke or CO2 alarm. And when it hears it's a standard set beeping, it will actually say, oh, that's a smoke alarm, and send you a notification. So that's one. Google also has that as part of their Nest Aware subscription, their new Nest.
The new plans only, though.
Yeah, new plans only. So your cameras, does your display also listen if you set it to?
That's a good question. I do not know that all the displays do have microphones.
Yeah, so I would imagine anything with a microphone could do this. And then your Amazon Echo, if you turn on the Echo Guard feature, will do this. And then if you don't have any of those devices, but you have a Ring system, you can spend $35 for a Ring Alarm Smoke and CO listener. And that'll listen for carbon monoxide. I don't know if I've said carbon dioxide in the last few minutes, but it's monoxide. And you just put these little sensors near your existing detectors, and when those sound, you get an alert. It does require the Ring Alarm security set, so you have to have that to make this work.
Did you mention the inexpensive Wyze cameras? Because they have that feature as well. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's like you're not paying attention when I'm talking. Oh,
I'm
hurts me.
zoned out.
It hurts me.
I'm searching for products.
That's true.
Sorry.
You can get a $30 Wyze camera.
Yeah.
And you'll have to
$20.
Actually, it's $20. It's $19.99.
I know.
Plus shipping and handling, though, y'all. Okay.
Yeah. So if you're gonna replace your smoke detectors, even though we've given you some inexpensive options, it's gonna cost you. Stacy, I think you tested the First Alert product that has Madam A built in, so it's got a speaker, so you can do voice commands and you can listen to music.
This is the First Alert one-link safe and sound AVS AC hardwired smoke combination smoke and carbon monoxide detector with battery backup. Whew. This is the mother of all detectors. I'm not going to lie, but it is $249. It sounds good. You wanted some extra features in your smoke detector? You can talk to Madam A.
Yeah, you'll get them.
You can listen to podcasts. Yeah, it sounds really good, but it was a little weird.
I have speakers already in every room I want them in. So if you already have a bunch of speakers, to me, I don't know if this makes sense, but it's an option. It's an option.
And it does sound good as a speaker. All right. What else is there?
Well, we mentioned Google before, Nest Protect. Those are the smart home smoke detectors for $119. Cheaper than the First Alerts. Much the same in terms of functionality. So like if you're all in on Google and Nest, this may be the way to go. If you're HomeKit, I kind of figured you're going to spend like $200 to $300 per smoke detector. But we found, and we have not tested, but we found on Amazon the one-link Wi-Fi smoke and carbon monoxide alarm. It is Apple HomeKit enabled. And at first I'm like, is it just a listening device? Kind of like what we talked about earlier. But it's not. It's actually a true detector.
Oh, nice.
$50.
Right.
$50.
There you go. So that's the market mostly on smart smoke detection. And hopefully something in there makes your life a little easier, better. I should also add that Google Protect does give you a presence detector. So you had asked about extra sensors in these things. That one has a presence detector.
Like a motion sensor.
Yeah. So it'll talk to the system and be like, oh, it looks like no one's home. Let's turn the Nest thermostat down.
I want individual custom presence, but hey, this is good. It's a step.
Presence,
I know. I'm so needy.
Yeah. Okay. So, reminder, if you have a question and would like us to answer it for you, give us a call at 512-623-7424. And you will also be entered to win the Schlag Lock. So, I hope to hear from you. That concludes this portion of the show, but please stay tuned because our guest, Andrew Farah of Density, is going to be talking about doing people counting. He's also going to actually be talking about how to do that in an anonymous way that, is anonymous by design as opposed to taking your data and anonymizing it afterwards. So it's a good interview, and we also do talk about the impact of COVID on his business. Stay tuned for that, but first, a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Calyx. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick break from the Internet of Things podcast for a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Calix, and I have Michael Weening here with me. Michael, can you quickly remind us, who is Calix?
Thanks, Stacy. Calix is a provider of cloud, software, systems, and services on a mission to assist service providers of all sizes to deliver amazing experiences to their subscribers in the home on future-proof and autonomous fiber networks. I'm really excited to continue our discussion on the Revenue Edge solution, and you can learn more at calix.com/Revenue Edge.
All right, Michael, can you tell me why now is such a critical time for the service providers that you're working with?
Sure, Stacy. It's pretty clear that broadband has become as important as electricity and water to those of us who are working at home. Calix customers have built out the most advanced fiber networks in the country as it becomes clear that cable is no longer good enough. 5 years ago, when you were downloading a big file, that 30 meg upload speed was not a problem. Not any longer. As anyone on a cable network knows, that Zoom call incident of, did he drop? Is he frozen? Is no longer acceptable, which means our fiber customers are perfectly positioned to help their communities thrive as the new abnormal of people not returning to the office settles in and people demand the best upload speed around. At the same time, service providers without a fully managed Wi-Fi experience see service calls as much as 70% higher. At this critical time, we have launched the world's fastest and most powerful Wi-Fi 6 managed experience to allow service providers to step up their game in a huge way and make sure that their communities are happy and can take that Zoom call in their home office or out on the deck with confidence.
Thank you, Michael. Can you remind people where to go to find out more information about Calix?
Thank you, Stacy. If they are a service provider, they can go to calix.com/Revenue Edge. And if they want to learn more about the awesome Blast Wi-Fi 6 systems, I encourage them to go to blastwifi.com and send their service provider an email if they're not offering ultimate Wi-Fi in your town. If they're a Calix customer, they'll listen.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and today's guest is Andrew Farah, who is co-founder and CEO of a company called Density. Hi Andrew, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Stacey?
I am excellent. So, this is very exciting to me because I talked to you like 2015. When we last talked, you were in upstate New York building a people counter for places. So I have to ask, what is it that you're doing now at Density?
We are still building a people counter for places.
Excellent.
We remain focused on this very specific and stubborn problem.
All right. So let's talk about why we need a people counter for places first off.
Sure. So in 2015, when we last spoke, we were in Syracuse, New York, and we were building a people counter to figure out how busy our favorite coffee shop was. To be perfectly honest, the entire business was essentially predicated on trying to solve a very lazy problem. If you've ever been to upstate New York, then you know that the wind chill can be -20 and the snow can be 3 feet high. And if you're ever walking through that 5 blocks to go to a coffee shop, it's incredibly irritating to hit a 20-minute line. So it's a really lazy problem. And today, although we believe we'll begin and end in coffee shops, we work with some of the largest companies in the world to help them understand how their real estate and how their physical buildings are being used. And we do that by designing a custom sensor that can, in real time, without invading privacy and with very high degrees of accuracy, count people in space. And we do this for, I think our customers manage about 1 billion square feet of space.
That is crazy. Yes. And when we talked, those many years ago, I was not as excited about checking the coffee shops. Although I appreciate your problem. I was really excited, though, about the idea of being able to check on, hey, how long is the line at the DMV? Or things like,
Sure.
Hey, if a hospital emergency room could have something like this, they could track how busy they were in real time and feed that data into ambulance drivers. Like maybe they go someplace else. I was like, yes, it's important information. So we've had access to this information for a while. Even today, now I can look on, if I look up a place on Google on my phone, I get a little indicator saying, hey, I'm this busy right now. I think that's probably a different method of counting people in a place. But talk to me about how y'all started trying to count people and what issues that raised.
Well, I think that you're pointing out, frankly, something that we still very much intend to solve in the long run. It's just about solving the distribution problem. How do you get an intelligent device into every relevant room in the world? is a very hard problem. And it's not really a technology problem, although that's a part of the solution. It's mostly like, what are the strategies, markets, pricing, and features that sort of like combine to accelerate distribution into physical space? I would say like the end objective is, you should never have any building that's built without knowing how it's used. It's mostly just a question of like, where's their value in the near term and how do you use that value in the near term to accelerate distribution long term? And I would actually say today, understanding how busy or how many people are in a space is especially important, which perhaps we can talk about.
I was like, is this where we talk about the pandemic?
I am shelter in place. You're probably shelter in place. We can talk about it now. We can talk about it later. But I think that the salient point is that in the U.S., just to give some numbers, there's $1 trillion spent on space that has no one in it. And I'm talking about just office space. If you add up retail, hospitality, industrial, and sort of like the long tail, it's much closer to like 16 to 18 trillion spent on space with nobody in it. And we're talking about just the United States.
And is this no one in it like I have an office building and people are only in it from 8 to 5? Or is this like I have an office building and no one just happens to be in it ever?
Control for, and I can share some cool numbers, control for the hours where you closed. So just 9 to 5 or just 9 to 6 or whatever the time is in operation. Also not buildings that are completely empty, meaning like unoccupied. I mean like occupied, paid for, between the hours of 9 to 5, not used. And the crazy thing is that the entire industry knows they have this problem. They just can't figure out which 41%, which is one of the drivers of our product.
Okay, so that $1 trillion is 41% unoccupied?
That's correct.
Okay, let's talk about the quarantine because it doesn't seem fair. We're living it. We're dealing with issues right now where, hey, if I have a restaurant right now in some places, it can only be 25% full or maybe 50% full. And how would you guys solve those problems?
We work with a lot of large organizations who are trying to understand how their portfolios get used. And we also have a set of customers that fall into the category that you would sort of think of as either essential businesses or mid-market businesses that are not necessarily companies like CBRE or Amazon or these sort of much larger corporates. And in the last 90 days, we grew 563% quarter over quarter.
Wow.
To be honest, like it's extremely hard to reconcile the fact that there is like devastation and destruction and hurt, while at the same time it is accelerating distribution of a product that we build. It's a very weird thing for that to be true, for both of those things to be true. And I would say like I and our team are not untouched by the tragedy that we're currently in. However, the reason we have heard from meat processing plants, fulfillment centers, grocery stores, and other essential businesses, in addition to rapid expansion in corporate offices, is safety. And it's really simple. Georgia, Arkansas, Texas, South Carolina, Virginia, they all have capacity limits now. Governors have issued limits on the number of people that can be in a physical space. And when you do that, the only way to adhere or comply with those limits is to measure it in the first place. And so we now are deployed in grocery stores, fulfillment centers, meat processing plants, and a whole host of other essential businesses, as well as truly scaled deployments inside offices as people, one, try to keep people safe and operate businesses and leave them open or begin to reopen in sort of local economies, and two, keep employees safe when they bring them back. I should just clarify what we do is really straightforward. It's called Safe by Density, and we use the exact same platform that we've been selling for years to allow you to understand whether or not it's safe to go in. So we count the number of humans that go through a point of entry. We compare that with the square footage or the allowable capacity, and then we just display on digital signage, television or iPad or whatever else, even a mobile application, whether or not you should go or wait. We do alerting in real time. So within 700 milliseconds, we can tell you whether or not you are approaching or exceeding a capacity limit that you set for a floor or a building or a room. And then the last thing is compliance or just analytics. Like how is your space performing across many different sites? Honestly, I hope it's a product that is short-lived. And one, the silver lining for the team is that it's something that we think can be helpful for people.
Well, and this data over time could also transition to becoming, to be part of like an API that just gives more information to people going forward. Let's actually help people real fast by explaining to them exactly what it is that you offer. Because we've kind of talked, hey, it's people counting, but you have physical sensors
Sure.
that you put on doors. And tell us about your product.
So people counting started in the 1980s, mostly focused in retail. And counting humans in space mostly had to do with being able to compare that with your register. So your conversion and trying to figure out essentially how many people did you bring in and then how many did you convert? And the original sensor, like the OG sensor, was a brake beam sensor. It was battery powered. It fired a single laser, sort of a infrared laser across a threshold. And as people walked through, it would increment on a little analog display. It would just increment upward. There was no bidirectionality. So you couldn't tell if someone was leaving or entering. At the end of the day, the clerk would go up to the little counter and divide by 2. And that's how you got your visitor count. This is the 1980s. Since the 1980s, the concept of people count has evolved. But for the first, call it 30 years or so, it was mostly focused on still retail. And so you had everything from MAC address tracking to Bluetooth beacons to what is sort of like, I think, the more advanced stuff today, which is facial recognition and gender and identity and being able to target or know sort of repeat buyers. We believe that, retail is interesting, but I don't much care about trying to track a customer and their behavior. I'm much more interested in the 71 billion square feet of physical space that's completely unmeasured around the world. In order to, go after that, you have to design a system that's real time. So moves very fast and can report quickly, powered device, accurate. So you have to know what ground truth is and you have to be able to prove that it's accurate. And then 3, you have to design a system that's anonymous because frankly, living in a world that is essentially mass surveillance is not one that we'd really like to have. The way we achieve that is with a depth system. So this sensor is about the size of an Apple TV. It gets mounted above a point of entry, like a nicely designed shower head. It can also be floated like above a hallway. So it doesn't have to have a door. Okay. And this little Apple TV sized device has 800 subcomponents in it. The key ones are an illumination package that is 4 infrared lasers. So these class 1 eye-safe lasers that bounce light off of objects as they move beneath. And you can imagine it's about one device for every single or double entryway. And as long as, even if you have one floor building that has 5 points of entry, they operate as a mesh and can automatically count or keep track of occupancy in real time inside that floor.
And how does it deal with things like double counting or dividing by 2 in the original 1980s example?
So imagine what you're looking at is a bird's eye view. And imagine that bird's eye view is instead of made up of color and a video image, imagine everything is grayscale and everything is silhouettes. Depth, when it's rendered human readable, is essentially millions of height values, very, very fine height values. How long does it take for the light to bounce off of an object and return to the sensor? And so when we sort of process all that, which all happens locally on the device, we have a machine learning model, several machine learning models that we have trained to understand what is a manipulated object, so a giant box, and what's a human. And we have seen all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, people are extraordinarily weird. I mean, we're talking about like boxes and babies and bicycles. And at one point, I think in our training, we even saw in our training data a mannequin. That's extremely hard for us to count because it looks like a human. But the upshot is, because of like the system that we designed, it's extremely accurate. And we can audit every sensor's accuracy regardless of its deployment.
Okay, so this is out there. This is in the world. What are your customers using it for outside of the pandemic? So you had actually a real business before COVID-19. What were they doing with it?
We were working with companies to help them identify wasted space, which I touched on briefly. Figuring out how to do workplace design. So we were deployed across a headquarters of a large tech company. They put us in every conference room and every floor across their headquarters. And 92% of working hours, every conference room was in use. And there's a big difference between the room being booked and held for someone and in use, a human physically in the space. 92% of working hours, every conference room was in use. However, their architect had recommended that they design each of those rooms to support 8 people. 83% of the time, it was no greater than 2. 50% of the time, it was no greater than 1. And when we showed them the data, they said, "You've got to be kidding me. This is the opposite of what we were told human behavior would probably look like." And they are now designing their next building based on historical utilization data. So that's sort of an example in which reshaping space is sort of one of the end results of understanding how current buildings are used.
Now, we have a lot of people in the space. We have companies that are in light fixtures, like Enlighted, Lucid, others that are using sensors in the ceiling to say, hey, there are people in this room, or there are not a lot of people in this room. So what advantages do you have over this? It feels like I could get occupancy a bunch of different ways.
Yeah. Do you remember the beacon craze of 2014?
I do remember the beacon craze. Yes.
it was like, I remember there was this great article by Steve Cheney, who was working at Estimote at the time, who had just gone through YC or whatever else. And he said, for $100 million, we can blanket the US in beacons and all of a sudden understand how everyone uses the space. And around that same time, 2014, 2015, big promises around energy use and smart buildings, like the whole smart building craze. So I guess what I would say is like occupancy data, the way that people talk about occupancy data is the same way that people talk about like air conditioning. They're just like, it exists. It's not hard. It's a commodity. The reality is that it doesn't exist. There's a reason that, a lot of these organizations have struggled to scale. And it's one of the reasons actually that most of our customers are even density customers in the first place. Frankly, we were trying to solve the coffee shop problem. We got pulled into real estate specifically because there's a bone pile of bad occupancy sensors.
Okay, so what makes for a bad occupancy sensor, and what do you guys do, or how did you solve the problem accurately?
You ever been in a conference room and like the lights go off and then you have to wave your arms to like get the lights to go back on?
Yes, that's like that's half of my house, but yes.
Okay, cool. So that's enlighted. Those are small passive infrared sensors that are looking for motion. The problem is if you sit still for too long, then, they're not granular enough to be able to identify motion. There's also a big difference between motion and occupancy. So PIRs will often have really long battery lives and, it's got this great range and it's used for security and everything else. But if you have a bush outside of a window and that bush moves, the shadow will trigger the motion detector. The other one is also just lighting generally. Many sensors, especially sensors that claim to be anonymous but are really just cameras, there's a lot of those. Those rely on ambient light. So at night, they can't count. They go blind unless they have their own illumination source, which, is like either a laser system or infrared. MAC address tracking, which you're super familiar with and we played with early on in our development. It's really cool. Like it's really magical to see the number of phones that show up on your terminal when you're looking for probe requests. The downside is that the accuracy is like terrible. And it's because everyone's carrying multiple devices. And it's because you pick up on printers and you pick up on all sorts of other devices that aren't necessarily what you're looking for. And so I think the issue is more just as soon as you try to actually solve the problem, and this is a fundamental problem, I think, with IoT in general, as soon as you try to actually solve the problem of occupancy, you run into the long tail of edge cases that essentially eliminate 98% of the market. And you turn to a camera or you turn to us.
Do you feel that giving people privacy and not tracking their MAC address and just saying this is a body in time and space, do you feel you lose because you're doing that or lose out on anything because of that?
I like the concept of you are not the product. The product is the product. You're the user. I believe that anonymity by design is very different than anonymized. There are a lot of people that claim like, well, we're anonymizing the data. So like we don't have access to it. Well, that's a data governance. You're only as good as your data governance. If you were anonymous by design, there's an amazing person named, I believe it's Dr. Zakarian. She was Toronto's head of privacy. And she had this clear distinction around anonymous by design and anonymized. And I think that as we sort of fast forward 4 or 5 years and you sort of think about like, what is the infrastructure of the future? There's no circumstance in which humans, barring catastrophe, there is truly no circumstance in which humans don't eventually figure out how people are using the buildings they're building. It's just a question of whether or not they're willing to trade personal privacy in exchange for the utility of measuring how space is used. And while I would argue that utility existed pre-COVID and was valid enough to distribute and modernize infrastructure, post-COVID, there are some very loud voices about the value of mass surveillance. And I think that as organizations, as companies, as states, and as sort of like federal governments or sovereigns start to think about like what they're willing to trade, what their citizens are willing to trade, I think there's like huge costs to distributing mass surveillance. And I make a distinction between, I don't think cameras are bad. I just think there's a difference between cameras for security and cameras for surveillance. One is retroactive. You look at it afterward in the event that there's an incident. The other is active monitoring. I think if there's an alternative that is as accurate or more accurate, you will find that people choose that option. It's a world that I'd prefer to live in, frankly.
And your customers, are they, especially as we're talking about things like safe, because I can see on one hand, it's great to know capacity, but I could also see on the other hand, it'd be great if there was a solution that gave you capacity and also could help with contact tracing, for example. That's a 2-for-1, right? And I can see businesses saying, ooh, I could buy this anonymous thing and not have tracking or exposure notification, or I could buy something that offers both.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly the consideration that people are trying to make. Are we willing to use the current circumstances to distribute technology and systems that help us in the near term, but long-term remain installed? And I think that if you take a long-term view of what remains installed, then what weighs in the balance is the need to do contact tracing should go away. But what follows is the ability for a 23-year-old security guard who has access to full coverage, mass surveillance, and an intelligent system across 10 million square feet of space when they're looking at their security laptop. And that exists to keep people safe from we have security cameras at your points of entry, but that does not yet exist today in 99% of buildings in places where you have a perceived expectation of privacy. Your desk, your office, a conference room, the bathroom. I mean, this is where people are talking about actually deploying cameras. It's not a joke. And I think it's do we want to live in that world? And I think sometimes, and I get a little bit fired up about this, but one of the things that I would love to know is, and we'll often ask is, if I told you that there was a camera above your desk and it was there to just find out how often you used your desk, how would you feel about that? And let's say that the camera was anonymizing, but how would you feel about that?
I would not like that for a variety of reasons. I mean, number one, I'm I would like the freedom to sit there and put my head in my hands and go, I don't want to work right now. And also the stuff I work on is kind of sensitive.
I mean, we have heard stories of cameras with duct tape on them, with cameras that have been found destroyed by a baseball bat, and with cameras that have been found in toilets. I guess I'm not terribly concerned about the outcome of mass surveillance, because I think that the culture in most developed countries is such that it's a really great pushback on organizations that want to scale surveillance systems. And we've seen this within our own customer base. They struggle to scale systems because as soon as they hit the culture barrier.
Okay, because I see with especially blue-collar workers, I mean, white-collar workers, sure, but if you look at something like Amazon warehouses, there's lots of cameras there. And I think there is a class divide in privacy for these things.
You're absolutely right. You're a higher paid white-collar worker, knowledge worker. You probably fall into the category that I just mentioned. You work in a factory and you probably don't. And I think that's national privacy legislation is probably coming. I don't know when it'll show up, but it's probably coming. And probably necessary.
One will hope, although given the current climate, I'm not sure. But this is a debate for probably drinks. So, Andrew, thanks for coming on the show this week. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Stacey. It was awesome to catch up.
That's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening. And remember, if you'd like more IoT news, sign up for my newsletter at stacyoniot.com. We'll see you next week.